I have something I want to show you this evening. This is kind of like a little rock collection, some of my more favorite ones. There's a lot of other rocks that I've collected over the years, but some of these are pretty cool. This one's, I think, got in a store. It's got a tag on the back, so. And I don't know if that says something on it. It's so worn if it does, but that one's just kind of shiny. This one's neat because it's got some fossils in it. You probably can't see that from there, but you can take my word for it. I don't remember where this one came from, but that's really cool. Yeah. And I've got all kinds. I won't show you them all. This one, of course, that one, you can see that's an arrowhead, right? Probably from one of the tribes that half the things around here are named after. So these are all pretty cool, and I've enjoyed finding them. I enjoy looking at them. I like just finding cool rocks, and if I'm at a beach, I like skipping them, throwing them out in the water. But one thing I don't like doing with rocks is throwing them at people. But, you know, a lot of Christians actually do. A lot of Christians really like throwing rocks, throwing stones at people. And I never quite understand why that is the case, because Jesus Christ taught us that that's not something that we should ever do. You can turn to John chapter 8. I'm reminded of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ. And he certainly had a good point. He certainly had a good point. Far too often, Christians are fond of throwing stones at people. But Jesus Christ taught that that was something that they just should never do. I think probably most people are familiar with this record, but we're going to read it. And what I'm going to be getting into this evening, and we won't finish this evening, and we're going to probably be on this for a little bit, but I'm going to be on the overall subject of forgiveness. That's the overall topic that we will be on. And tonight we're going to be looking at that the tender heart forgives. In John chapter 8, verse 2, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, he being Jesus Christ, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. So, can you picture this? Here he is. It's early in the morning, and he's teaching. And in the middle of that teaching, these guys come in, and they throw this woman in there at his feet. And they say, this woman was taken in the very act of adultery. Moses said in the law, stone her. What do you say? Verse 6. This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. They weren't interested in what this woman did or didn't do. They weren't interested in justice. They weren't interested in anything except trying to find another way of getting at Jesus Christ. Trying to find some way that they could accuse him. Some way where they could trap him. And they thought they had him in this situation because here was this woman taken in adultery. And if Jesus Christ said, well, no, don't stone her, then they could say, well, he's breaking the law. The law said stone her. And on the other hand, if he said stone her, they'd say, well, where's all this compassion that you're always talking about? Where's all this love that you're always talking about? But Jesus stooped down, continuing in verse 6, and with his finger wrote on the ground, and it says, as though he heard them not. There was a purpose in him doing that. There's an Orientalism behind that, an Eastern custom. That in the East, one of the things that that a man of God would do while waiting on revelation was to just draw in the dirt, draw in the dirt. And he's just waiting for God's answer here. He's not going to be forced into giving them whatever they want to hear or forced into some trap. He's not going to feel required to come up with something. He's going to look and see what God's answer in that situation was. It's such a great key, and you see it in his life all the time. Certainly because everything that he said, he spoke the words not of his own self, but as the Father gave him to speak. But that habit of going to God, that habit of going to God. So what he answers here, what he says, what he does is the will of God in that situation. Verse 7. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin, let him first cast a stone at her. Let him that is without sin cast the first stone. That was his answer. Okay? You feel like she ought to be stoned? Then whoever's without sin, you throw the first one. And again he stooped and wrote on the ground. And when they heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. None of them could throw the stone. None of them could stop and pick up that stone and throw it. Why? Because they knew in their hearts that they had all sinned as well. And they might have been willing to still throw the stones, knowing the group of people he was dealing with, but then they couldn't claim that in front of other people, could they? They couldn't claim that they were perfect in that way, could they? It wasn't that their hearts were necessarily changed. They just knew they couldn't get away with it then. Verse 10. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Now, he was the one guy in the room that could have thrown a stone, right? He was the one person in that room who was without sin. And if anybody on that basis that he had just said, on that standard, had a right to, Jesus Christ had the right to throw the stone. But he did not condemn her either. Had the woman done wrong? Yes. Yes. There was no question that she had committed a sin, that she had done something that was considered very wrong. Something that, yes, if you go back to the Old Testament law, was punishable by death. In the Old Testament law, adultery was punishable by death. So when they said, Moses said in the law, stone her, they weren't lying. And he didn't say that they were. She could have been killed, but that wasn't the will of God in this situation. She had done something wrong, but he didn't condemn her. What does he go on to say? Go out and live it up, commit adultery as many times as you'd like, sleep with everybody you want to, go out while you're at it and commit a half dozen other sins, right? No, he doesn't say that either, does he? He doesn't condemn her, but he says, go and sin no more. It wasn't that the sin was okay. It wasn't that he was condoning that. He was just willing to forgive. People make a mistake of failing to distinguish between condoning something and forgiving something. To condone is to allow. To condone is to approve, at least tacitly, by overlooking it. To condone is to accept something that isn't right. That's what it is to condone. Jesus Christ didn't condone her, neither did he condemn her. And that's the example that he set for us. We are to neither condone nor condemn that which is contrary to God's word. We are to forgive. We are to forgive. To reprove, yes, he reproved her in that situation. He told her, go and sin no more. but to have a heart that's willing to forgive. No matter what, we have to always be willing to forgive. And that's where the Pharisees, they missed it because they didn't see that heart of forgiveness that God had. And we're going to see that in the Old Testament. In thinking about this, I thought about what incident I might share of times where I have been wrong, where somebody's done something to hurt me, and I chose to forgive. And I could actually share lots and lots of situations like that, but I can't do it without, probably giving away for somebody who I might be talking about. And I'd never do that, because once I forgive, well, then that's sealed. That's just lockbox. You never bring that up. You never talk about it. So instead, I chose to pick one of the many great examples we have from God's Word. So in the life of David, and we could find many examples from David's life. Times where he was forgiven, but also times where he forgave. If you know anything about the life of David, you know that he spent a good long part of it on running from one person or another. No sooner, basically, is David anointed by the prophet Samuel to be king, that he comes into the court of Saul. And he comes into the court of Saul because Saul's looking for somebody that could quiet the spirit in him when he was troubled, because he had walked outside of the will of God and now no longer had the Spirit of God, but rather an evil spirit that was bothering him. And so David comes into the court and he would play for him. He'd play his harp. And that music would just heal and bring Saul back to his right mind. But after David kills Goliath, and after he goes out subsequently and starts, fighting against the Philistines and beating them, Saul gets real jealous. He hears people praising David and singing songs about David and how great David is. And Saul killed his hundreds, but David's killed his thousands or 10,000s. So Saul wants David dead. He wants David dead because David's doing such a great job of what Saul ought to be doing and helping all of Israel. But because David is becoming popular, because David is in his mind taking some of the glory away from himself, Saul wants David dead. And David's got to run for his life. On I believe two occasions, David, while he's still in the court, Saul's throwing javelins at him. Isn't that right? And then he has to flee for his life, and then he's hiding out in caves, and Saul's after him. And time again, it's a close call. Really close calls where it just was God protecting him. And David, he trusted in God in those situations. And you can read all these wonderful Psalms so many of them that are written, where he goes to God and just cries to God for help and for God's protection. Those take place during that time where he is fleeing for his life from Saul. David has done nothing wrong. He has done absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, what he's done is right. And it's a help and a blessing to Saul and all of Israel. And his thanks for that is Saul is trying to kill him. That's the picture. And then, one day, Saul dies. He dies in battle. He dies in battle, and the five senses would look like that's the reason that he was in a battle and he died. But the spiritual reasons behind it was because of Saul's rebellion, his refusal to do what God had told him, and then his going to the witch of Endor once the Spirit of God left him. And then somebody comes to David, and they bring that news to David. Now, if you just stop for a second, if you didn't know the record, especially, What do you think somebody in David's situation would do with that kind of news? They'd celebrate, wouldn't they? I mean, here's this guy that's been trying to kill them. Yeah, he's in hiding still because Saul is after his life. This should be great rejoicing. This should be a celebration. My enemy's dead. This guy that's been trying to kill me for no reason is dead. This should be wonderful news. The fellow that brought him that news sure thought he'd take it that way. Told him how he was the one that finished Saul off. But it didn't work out real well for that fellow because that wasn't David's heart. David's heart was not one of celebrating. David's heart, well, it was a lot different. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 1. We see how David reacts in this situation. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11, then David took hold on his clothes and rent them. Rent them. An Eastern custom behind this that adds so much understanding to what happened there. He took his clothes and rent them. The clothes that it would be referring to specifically would be his mantle, and to rent was to tear. To rent his clothes didn't mean he went out and got a tuxedo. He rent them. He tore his clothes, which is a sign of, just great despair, or when something terrible went wrong. That's when you rent your mantle. And likewise all the men that were with him, they followed his example. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. Boy, that's not the usual kind of, response that you'd expect somebody would have when an enemy, somebody that had acted like an enemy, died. He mourned for Saul. He mourned for Saul. What an incredible heart David had. Had Saul done David wrong? You betcha. Had he hurt David? Yeah. And he was trying to hurt him unto death. And yet, David's heart was to forgive. David's heart was to forgive. That's what David did. A lot of times people think that the reason why they get hurt and hold on to hurt is because their hearts are more tender than other people's, that they're easily hurt, that they have a tender heart. And therefore they feel more justified in holding on to that hurt. But actually, a refusal to forgive is not tender-heartedness, it's hard-heartedness. We're encouraged in Ephesians, we'll see this again later on at some point, to be tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. You see, it's a tender heart that forgives, and David's heart was tender. He goes on to eulogize Saul. Look at verse 17. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. Verse 19. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Askelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the fathers of the uncircumcised triumph. Don't let the unbelievers hear about this, because they'll rejoice in that kind of news. The unbelievers, those that are just hard-hearted, they're the ones that will celebrate this. Ye mountains of Gilboa, verse 21. Let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. Saul was anointed with oil. That means that he had God's blessing. He was chosen king. He was anointed. He was God's man. And that put him in a category that nobody had the right to touch him, no matter what the situation. David, if it had been another enemy, then yeah, he'd fight. But this was the Lord's anointed. And because the Lord's anointed, David would never raise a hand to him. David felt bad the time that he cut his skirt to show him that he could have hurt him, because he was the Lord's anointed. Verse 22. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. He's talking about the great deeds that Jonathan and Saul had done, what they had accomplished. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet, with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? You know, Jonathan, it says, was closer to him than, a brother. And he had that great love for Jonathan. So Jonathan, there was a personal sense of loss there. But Saul, he didn't have that kind of relationship, obviously, with Saul, and yet still, all that he can do is speak about the good things that Saul had done. All he could remember was what Saul had done right, and those are the things that he spoke about. David had a heart that forgave, a heart of forgiveness. Go to Psalm 78. Psalm 78, you have sort of one of these places where it sort of sums up a lot of history of Israel. And we'll just read a small part of it. Psalm 78, verse 35. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. Nevertheless, they did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues. For their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away, and did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away, and cometh not again. Even though the times where Israel would seem to say the right thing, their heart wasn't in it. Their heart wasn't right. And yet God overlooked all of these things and remembered that they were just dust. He remembered their frame. God had compassion. He had mercy on them. He overlooked these things, and when they turned to him, he would always be there for them. Look at Psalm 145. Psalm 145, verse 8. The Lord is gracious and full of compassion, slow to anger, and of great mercy. That's the Lord. God had a law. He had a law so that man wouldn't just be so foolish that he would end up doing himself in. That mankind would not, by his own devices, cause his own extinction. But yet, as that law, although that law covered things like adultery, covered many other things, it still had compassion and mercy that went along with it. God was a God of compassion. He knew that people would fall short, but he was willing to forgive. And that's the thing that the Pharisees never got. It's what they never understood. And it's what religious people today still don't get. It's what some people, they just don't ever seem to catch on, is that there's mercy, there's forgiveness. You know, this book is meant to be read and believed, not meant to beat people over the head with. But that's sometimes what people do. They use the Bible to just beat people over the head with, to point out their shortcomings, to condemn them, to criticize them, to judge them. But that's not at all what Jesus Christ taught, was it? You know, I was thinking about it. He gets into, right following that record, he gets into a real strong confrontation with the religious leaders, the Pharisees. Boy, and you read that record, it gets pretty heated. You know, he says to them, "Ye are of your father the devil." You know, I'd say that's pretty, you know, that's not something you go around just saying to anybody, is it? Not a lot of people would take kindly to that if you said that to them, would they? There's probably some out there that would, probably some admit it, but you know, this group wasn't happy to hear it. And a lot of times, he really got into it with those religious leaders. But you know, I can't think of one time in the Gospels where he, in that same kind of harsh, strong rebuke, did that with anybody that they labeled a sinner. Think about it. You think if you can come up with any time where somebody that was doing something like adultery or lying or... No. He wasn't there to impute their trespasses unto them. He wasn't there to point out their sins. He was there to reconcile them to God. That's what he was there for. And that took forgiveness. And that's what God sent him to do. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9. This is his disciples have come to him and asked him to teach them how to pray. Okay. In verse 9 he says, "After this manner, therefore pray ye." Did he say pray this prayer all the time?
No.
He said, this is how you do it. You want to know how to pray? Okay, do it like this. Not do this same prayer, but do it like this. "Our Father, which art in heaven," yeah, you slip right into it, you know. "Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen." Okay, there's the prayer that a lot of us know. A lot of us that have grown up in different backgrounds know and know well. And this prayer is recorded in the Gospel of Luke as well as Matthew, and some of that wording is slightly different. In Luke it is, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespass against us." Here it's, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive those that are debtors." You see, forgiveness is just like the forgiving of a debt. If somebody forgives you a debt, do you owe them still? No. You know, that debt is forgiven. It's wiped out. You don't still owe them. It's just been forgiven. Did they pay it back before you forgave them? No. Then you wouldn't be forgiving a debt. They would have paid off the debt, right? You see, that's how forgiveness of a trespass against a brother is as well. It's not like that person needs to make restitution before you can forgive them. But that's sometimes what people want to make it. People want to make it that you got to fix this, and then I'll forgive you. But that's not what's taught there. Instead, it's forgiving. It's just forgiving. And we'll get into a lot more of that next time.